She thought it was just an old hut on a cliff, but what I found inside shouldn't have existed. I went up there without any expectations and read the words that changed everything. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. Rachel Morris had never considered herself the type of woman who simply walked away from everything. Yet there she was, 45 years old, divorced, exhausted beyond anything a good night's sleep could fix, and standing on the edge of a quiet trail that wound its way into the forgotten folds of the Appalachian Mountains. She used to think she knew what exhaustion meant. Deadlines at the accounting office, tax seasons that swallowed entire months, the slow-burn loneliness of a marriage that had begun dying long before her husband finally confessed he was leaving. That was a kind of exhaustion she could name, chart, even predict. This was different. This was the exhaustion of a soul that no longer recognized its own edges. She blamed no one but herself for letting life shrink her into a cautious, quiet version of who she once hoped to be. When her marriage was over, her co-workers offered well-meaning platitudes about new chapters and fresh air. But it wasn't the kind of air she needed. She didn't want loud shouts of encouragement or forced social outings or any of the other things people suggested to a newly divorced woman. She needed the kind of air that only existed in places where people rarely went, air untouched by gossip, by deadlines, by the hum of small-town curiosity. That was how she found herself reading an old online forum one evening, stumbling across a nearly forgotten side route off the Appalachian Trail. The route hadn't been maintained in decades. No markers, no reliable maps. That alone drew her in. If the world expected her to heal neatly, quietly, politely, she would do the opposite. She arrived in the small mountain town the night before she planned to hike, renting a room above a general store that smelled of cedar and dust. The owner, a man in his 70s with a white beard and a baseball cap, faded from sun and rain, leaned against the counter as she checked in. "You sure you want that trail?" he asked without judgment. "Most people don't even mention it anymore." She nodded, offering a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm sure." He studied her for a moment before giving a thoughtful hum. "Well, follow the map as far as the old logging road, then trust your feet. Markers'll be gone. Storms took most of them out years back." The next morning she rose early, packed her gear, and stepped out to cool mountain air. The sky threatened rain, but that didn't deter her. She set out on foot, her boots crunching over gravel as she crossed from town into rising forest. It didn't take long for civilization to fade behind her, replaced by tall pines and the earthy scent of damp moss. She walked steadily, focusing on the rhythm of her breath, the weight of her pack, the satisfying burn in her legs. The trail rose and curved like a spine through the hills. Hours passed in comfortable quiet until she spotted a wooden sign ahead, so weather-worn it was barely legible. The lettering had cracked and nearly blended with the grain, but she could just make out remnants of words. Old Ridge No Maintenance. Beside the sign stood an elderly park ranger she hadn't expected to see. His uniform was old but clean, his posture straight in a way that suggested decades of watching trails and storms with equal patience. He nodded to her. "Heading up?" he asked, voice raspy yet gentle. She confirmed, and he scratched thoughtfully at his jaw. "If you hear fire where it doesn't belong, turn back." She paused, unsure whether to laugh. "Fire?" He lifted his gaze to the ridge above them, its silhouette dark against the gray sky. "Happens now and then. Strange sounds travel far up there. Folks see flickers they can't explain. Maybe nothing. Maybe something." He didn't elaborate. He simply adjusted the strap of his faded pack and walked away, leaving her with more questions than answers. The deeper she went, the stranger the forest felt. Not dangerous exactly, but ancient. Everything seemed older than it should be. Fallen branches had rotted into layers soft as soil. Tree trunks bore scars that looked almost like writing, and the air carried a heavy stillness that pressed against her ears. Hours passed this way, her path narrowing until it barely existed. Every now and then, she heard faint crackling. Too sharp to be leaves, too irregular to be branches rubbing in the wind. It reminded her of a distant fire. She turned in every direction, expecting to see smoke swirling through the trees, but she found nothing. Just silence resettling around her like a thick blanket. By late afternoon, the ridge opened slightly, revealing a small clearing with an abandoned bench made of split logs. She dropped her pack and took a long drink of water, letting herself enjoy the quiet. She thought of her old life, the office with its humming fluorescent lights, the arguments with her ex-husband about problems neither of them ever figured out how to articulate, the nights lying awake feeling both crowded and alone at the same time. Up here, none of that mattered. She was invisible to the rest of the world, and for the first time in a long while, she liked that feeling. A soft wind brushed past her ear, followed by that same faint crackling sound. She shivered. She continued until the trail abruptly veered toward the cliff's edge. The drop was steep, disappearing into a valley dense with dark evergreens. She stepped carefully, adjusting her footing until her eyes caught something impossible. Across the narrow gap, built into a shallow recess of the rock face itself, stood a small wooden cabin. It was perched at an unnatural angle, somehow both balanced and precarious. The structure looked old logs weathered to silver, roof sagging slightly. But what held her gaze was the warm flicker of orange through the single window. Fire. Real, unmistakable firelight. Her heart hammered loud enough she could hear it in her ears. She squinted, half convinced her eyes were deceiving her. But the light swayed again, casting faint gold against the jagged stone surrounding the cabin. Someone was there, or had been very recently. She scanned the area for signs of a trail leading to the structure, and soon found something even stranger. A crude ladder made of wood and thick bamboo, propped against the base of the rock wall. It rose toward the cabin in angled segments, secured with knotted ropes that looked brittle from years of sun. She approached slowly, her every instinct arguing whether this discovery was a blessing or a trap. Her fingers brushed one of the wooden rungs. It groaned softly beneath her touch. She tested another. Same response aged, but holding. She swallowed the knot of nerves in her throat and began to climb, her boots pressed against the rungs, each step eliciting a dry creak. The ground drifted farther below. A gust of wind pushed against her back and she clung tighter, breath caught halfway between exhilaration and dread. Halfway up, she looked down and froze. In the dirt beneath the ladder, faint but fresh, were footprints. Large ones, deeper than hers, angled directly toward the ladder. She inhaled sharply. Someone else had been here, and not long ago. The idea chilled her more than the wind. But she couldn't go back now. She had to see what was inside. She reached the top and stepped onto the small platform outside the cabin. The door stood ajar, warm light spilling through the crack. She pushed it gently, and it swung inward with a slow moan. The air inside was warmer than she expected, carrying the lingering scent of ash and something old. Leather, ink, paper. Her eyes adjusted gradually, revealing the cramped but meticulously arranged single-room dwelling. There was a narrow bed, with a wool blanket tucked neatly at the corners, a small clay stove where embers still glowed faintly, and against the far wall, a simple wooden desk. On that desk lay piles of handwritten pages, some bound with twine, others scattered as if someone had been sorting them. A rusted tin mug sat beside an inkwell crusted with dried black. A typewriter rested near the edge, a sheet of paper still threaded through its rollers, stopped mid-sentence. It looked as though the writer had stepped away minutes ago, not years. Then she saw the man. He sat in the wooden chair by the desk, slumped slightly, head tilted to one side, in a posture disturbingly reminiscent of someone just resting. But his chest did not rise. His skin was colorless, stretched thin over bone. His hair, silver and unkempt, fell over a gaunt forehead. Yet there was something hauntingly familiar about his face, something she had seen on book covers, in magazine features, in old interviews that had resurfaced every few years whenever someone wanted to dredge up another theory about his disappearance. It hit her like a cold wave. She was looking at Andrew Kelvin. Andrew Kelvin, the American literary icon who vanished 12 years prior without leaving a single credible clue. The man whose novels had been dissected in classrooms, whose interviews had once been quoted endlessly, whose sudden disappearance had sparked documentaries, investigations, conspiracies. Thousands of people had searched for him. None had succeeded. And yet here he was, sitting in a forgotten cabin on a cliff no one traveled to anymore. Her breath caught painfully in her chest. She staggered backward, hand pressed to her mouth as disbelief battled with rising fear. Kelvin's disappearance was more than a cold case. It was American folklore, and she had stumbled directly into the heart of it. She forced herself forward, compelled not by courage, but by a strange, solemn pull, as though the room itself demanded witnesses. She approached the desk and noticed a white envelope placed neatly atop a stack of papers. Her name wasn't written on it. Instead, a single date was inked in a precise, elegant hand. Today's date. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. Inside lay a single sheet. "If you are reading this," it said, "the door was opened too soon." She stared, heartbeat pounding in her throat. The handwriting, she recognized it from photocopies of Kelvin's letters, published in a biography she had read years ago. The loops, the slant, the spacing identical. And yet, the date, the fresh ink, the impossibility of it all. She felt suddenly exposed, as if the walls were watching. The cabin, once merely strange, now seemed charged with a quiet, powerful presence. Someone had been here recently. Someone who wrote like Kelvin, or someone who wanted the world to think Kelvin had written again. Her instincts screamed at her to run. But before leaving, something compelled her to take a few of the loose pages from the desk, a decision she would question again and again in the days to come. She slipped them into her pack and backed out of the cabin, her pulse racing, the world shrinking to the sound of her own breath. Outside, the forest looked different. The wind had stilled. The valley below lay in perfect silence. When she set foot on the ladder, it wobbled faintly, and she hesitated. Then she began her descent, one rung at a time, acutely aware that she was no longer alone. Not in the way she had been before discovering the cabin. There was a presence on that ridge, in those woods, in that impossible cabin built into the stone. A presence that had noticed her. Halfway down, she stopped abruptly. Far below, printed in the damp soil, were footprints, fresh, deep, leading away from the ladder and disappearing into the trees. Someone had been watching her. Someone still might be. She climbed faster, breath tight, boots thudding against the rungs in urgent rhythm. As soon as her feet hit solid ground, she backed away from the cliff, scanning the forest for any movement. The trees stood motionless. The air held its breath. She turned and hurried back toward the faint trace of trail ahead, clutching the straps of her pack as if it were the only solid thing left in her world. She didn't dare look back at the cliff. She didn't need to. She already knew something had changed, and she would not walk out of these mountains the same person who entered them. Rachel did not look back at the cliff until the trees finally swallowed its jagged outline behind her. Even then, she felt its presence pressing against her spine, as though the cabin had grown eyes of its own and was following each hurried step she took. She had descended the ladder so fast, her palms were still raw from gripping the wood. The cold air cut at her skin, but she barely noticed. Her mind was lodged somewhere between shock and instinct, between trying to comprehend the impossible and trying to outrun it. She walked until her breath steadied, until the path beneath her feet began to resemble something familiar, though she knew she was far from any place she would call safe. Her pack felt heavier now, not because of its contents, but because of what those contents represented. The pages she'd taken from the cabin were tucked inside, and their weight seemed to pull her backward toward the ridge, as though insisting she return to read them under the same flickering firelight that had illuminated everything else. She knew she wouldn't return. Not willingly. Not after seeing the body of Andrew Kelvin, preserved like a silent witness. Not after touching a letter written with today's date. Something had been wrong in that cabin, not just unsettling but fundamentally impossible, and the forest felt like it knew she had trespassed into a space she was never meant to see. The trail narrowed as she moved downhill, weaving between tall pines and boulders covered in thick moss. The sky above had begun darkening into a smoky gray, the kind of color that foretold either rain or something colder. A faint breeze whispered through the leaves, and she found herself listening for footsteps, for branches snapping, for any sign that the owner of those footprints beneath the ladder had followed her. But the only sounds were her own breathing and the occasional cry of a distant bird. The forest should have brought comfort nature was familiar to her, a place where she'd always felt steadier than among people. But now every rustle made her shoulders tense. When she glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see a figure emerging from the shadows, she saw only trees standing stark and still. But the feeling lingered, sharp and insistent. After some time, she reached a small clearing where the earth dipped into a bowl of wet leaves. Exhaustion nudged at her legs, and she knew she needed to stop. Her hands trembled slightly as she slid her pack off and lowered herself onto a fallen log slick with moisture. For a long moment, she simply breathed and tried to slow her racing thoughts. Then she remembered the pages. Quietly, she pulled them out. There were 5 sheets in total, each covered in handwriting unmistakably similar to the letter she had found on the desk. The ink had dried into dark strokes, some lines slightly smudged, as though written in haste. At the top of the first page, centered neatly, were the words, Chapter 7. On the Ones Who Watch. A jolt ran through her. The phrasing felt deliberate, intentional, as though the pages had been waiting for her specifically. Not the world, not a publisher, not any of the millions who idolized Kelvin's writing, but for her. She forced herself to read. The passage described a group of individuals whose names never appeared in public record, men who lived outside the boundaries of law or fame, who had the ability to erase someone from the world without ever resorting to violence. Not because they killed, but because they specialized in making people disappear. People who wanted to disappear, or whose disappearance someone else wanted. People who had outgrown their lives, or who had learned something they were never meant to learn. The writing was atmospheric, eerie, and chillingly vivid. It spoke of shadows moving through cities and forests like ghosts, of footprints that vanished after being made, of a silence so practiced and absolute that entire lives could be erased with the closing of a door. These watchers, as the pages called them, were described not as villains, but as caretakers of forgotten stories, protectors of secrets, too dangerous or too heartbreaking to be told. Rachel felt a knot tightening in her stomach. The style was undeniably Kelvin's lyrical, contemplative, threaded with dread in a way that made every line feel like the beginning of a prophecy. But she couldn't ignore the timing. If Kelvin had been dead in that cabin for years, then who had written this? And who had placed it where she would find it? The thought made her lungs tighten until breathing became an effort. A gust of wind passed through the clearing, scattering dry needles across the ground. She looked up sharply. For a second, she thought she saw something moving behind the trees. A shape, maybe. Or just the way shadows shifted when the wind cut through them. She blinked, and it was gone. But her heart was already racing again. "We're done here," she whispered to herself, stuffing the pages back into her pack with shaking hands. She got up and kept walking, her pace faster now. The trail sloped downward more steeply, leading toward a section of dense undergrowth she vaguely remembered passing earlier that morning. The deeper she went, the stronger the sense grew that she was being guided or herded, rather than simply following a path. At times, she felt certain she heard a sound behind her, something soft, like breath or fabric brushing against bark. But whenever she stopped and listened, the forest slipped back into perfect stillness. The first real sign came when she reached a narrow ravine where a fallen tree formed a natural bridge. She stepped onto the trunk carefully, arms out for balance, and was halfway across when her eyes drifted to the far end of the ravine. That was when she saw him. The man stood just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the shadows. He wore a gray coat, slightly too large, with the hood pushed back to reveal short, dark hair. His posture was still unnervingly still, as though he had been carved from the same rock and bark surrounding him. His face was obscured by distance and shadow, but she knew without understanding how that he was looking directly at her. Her foot slipped slightly on the mossy bark, and she grabbed a branch to steady herself. When she looked again, he was gone. Not stepped back, not walked away. Gone, as though he had dissolved into the air. Adrenaline surged through her limbs. She pushed across the tree faster than was safe, landing hard on the other side. Her pulse hammered in her throat so violently she felt lightheaded. She tried to convince herself she had imagined him, that it was a trick of distance and shadow. But she had seen him. Someone had been standing there, watching her in utter silence. The pages in her bag seemed to burn against her back. She walked quickly now, breath uneven, every nerve straining for another sight of the man or the sound of steps following her. The forest felt alive in a way she'd never experienced before. Alert, almost focused. The deeper she went, the more she sensed that she was not escaping something, but moving directly into its path. She reached a point where the trail dipped into another small clearing and decided it was time to set up her tent. Night was approaching, and she didn't want to risk navigating the ridge in the dark. Her hands worked automatically, securing the tent stakes, shaking out the fabric, zipping the flaps. The familiar routine steadied her nerves just enough for her to believe she might rest for an hour or two. Night came quickly, swallowing the last traces of daylight. The forest outside her tent grew thick with darkness, and the quiet felt deeper than silence. It felt intentional. She lay inside her sleeping bag, listening to her heartbeat echo loudly in her ears. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe she was alone now, that she had imagined the figure in the woods. Then came the footsteps. They started faintly, so faintly, she might have missed them had she not been listening so intently to everything around her. Soft depressions in the earth, the whisper of weight shifting from heel to toe, a slow rhythm that drifted closer with each passing second. She froze, muscles locking, breath caught between her ribs. The steps stopped directly outside her tent. Silence filled the space between each heartbeat. She didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe too deeply. Someone stood just inches away, separated from her by nothing more than a thin sheet of nylon. A faint exhale fogged the material of the tent. Then another. Slow, measured breathing. Whoever it was, they were listening too. Rachel kept her eyes open in the dark, panic rising in a suffocating wave. After what felt like a lifetime, the breathing stopped. Then the footsteps returned, moving away this time, fading into the trees, until she could no longer tell whether the forest had resumed its natural quiet or whether someone was simply waiting far enough away to be undetected. She stayed awake the rest of the night. By dawn, her nerves were frayed, and her eyes burned with exhaustion. But she packed her gear quickly, unwilling to remain in the same place a moment longer. As she tightened the straps of her pack, she noticed something carved into the nearest tree trunk, a symbol, a circle with two slanted lines cutting through it. It matched exactly the one she'd seen on the pages the day before. Her stomach dropped. She didn't want to understand what that meant. She followed the trail again, but now her steps were quick and purposeful. She no longer cared about the view or the tranquility the mountains were supposed to offer. Her only goal was reaching the ranger station, a distant sliver of hope tied to the idea of people, of phones, of help. Around midday, she was making her way through a section of forest where the path twisted sharply around large boulders. Her mind was fixed on escape, not exploration. But as she rounded a bend, she stopped dead in her tracks. The man in the gray coat stood on the trail ahead. This time, he was close enough that she could see his face, though the expression revealed almost nothing. He was in his late 30s, perhaps early 40s, his features sharp but not unkind. His posture remained eerily still, hands loose at his sides, gaze fixed on her with an unsettling calmness. He made no move forward, no gesture of threat. He simply watched her, as though waiting for something. She felt her throat tighten painfully, fear and confusion colliding in her mind. Before she could summon words, before she could ask who he was or what he wanted, he moved, not toward her, but to the side. Slowly, deliberately, he extended his arm and revealed what he held, the folded map she had dropped earlier. Her map. He stepped forward just enough to place it gently on the rock in front of him. Then, without a single word, he stepped back into the trees and vanished as silently as he had appeared. Rachel stood frozen, barely breathing. He had followed her. He had been close enough to retrieve something she dropped, close enough to stand outside her tent, close enough to carve that symbol on the tree. She picked up the map with trembling fingers and clutched it to her chest. Then she ran. Not wildly, but with purpose, her fear propelling her faster than exhaustion could hold her back. The trail blurred under her feet, shadows stretching long in the dimming light. Hours later, as the forest began to thin, she finally saw the faint outline of the ranger station through the trees. Relief surged so violently through her that she nearly collapsed. Civilization. Shelter. People. She hurried toward the wooden building, her breath forming shaky clouds in the cooling air. What she didn't know, not yet, was that walking into that station wouldn't save her. It would only draw her deeper into the story she'd stumbled into. A story written by someone who was supposed to be dead, and watched over by someone very much alive. The ranger station looked smaller than Rachel remembered from the maps she had studied before her trip. She had imagined something sturdier, more official, the kind of place built to withstand storms and emergencies, with radios crackling and uniformed rangers ready to assist anyone who stumbled in from the wilderness. Instead, it was a modest wooden structure with a sagging porch roof, a faded green door, and windows that reflected nothing but the overcast sky. Still, it was a building, a sign of people, of help, of reality. And that alone was enough to make her quicken her steps, her boots thudding across the patchy dirt as she approached. She pushed the door open and was greeted by the faint smell of coffee, left too long on a burner, and the warmth of a wood stove in the corner. Behind a desk sat a young ranger with short, sandy hair, leaning back in his chair as he scribbled in a logbook. He looked up as she entered, startled by her abrupt arrival, then straightened and offered a polite smile that faltered when he saw her face. She imagined she must have looked wild, wind-blown hair, exhausted eyes, trembling hands still clinging to her map like a lifeline. "Mom," he said, standing. "Are you okay?" She tried to answer, but her voice caught in her throat. The events of the past 24 hours collided all at once in her mind. The cabin, the body, the letter, the footsteps, the breathing outside her tent, the man in the gray coat. Her knees wobbled, and she steadied herself with one hand on the wall. "I need help," she finally managed. "I found something. Someone. And someone has been following me." The ranger came around the desk, concern lining his features. "Let's sit down. My name's Dawson. Just tell me everything from the beginning." Everything. The word felt impossible, like trying to pour an entire ocean into a cup. But she sat at the small table in the center of the room, the wood scarred and stained from years of use, and began to speak. At first her words came out haltingly, but once she started describing the cabin, the details poured out. The unreachable cliff, the ladder, the fire that should not have been burning, the desk with its scattered papers, and the lifeless figure of the man she had instantly recognized. When she said his name, Dawson's expression changed subtly, though she couldn't place the exact emotion behind the shift. She continued anyway, telling him about the letter with the impossible date, the pages she had taken, and the mysterious figure who had followed her from the moment she left the cabin. When she finished, Dawson exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping an uneven rhythm on the table. He didn't call her crazy. He didn't dismiss her story. Instead, he gave her a long, measuring look, as though trying to decide how much he believed and how much he didn't dare to. "You said the man looked like Andrew Kelvin?" he asked finally. "He didn't look like him," she said. "He was him. I'm certain. I recognized him instantly." Dawson nodded slowly. "You know that Kelvin disappeared a long time ago." "I know," she snapped, frustration tightening her voice. "Everyone knows, but I'm telling you he was there, dead, in that cabin, and someone's been watching me since I left." He pressed his lips together. "All right. I'll call this in. We'll send officers out there as soon as possible." He paused, hesitating. "Do you have the pages you mentioned?" The question made her stomach twist. Something about the way he asked it felt too practiced, too pointed. She slid her pack closer to her, gripping the straps protectively. "Yes," she said. "They're mine." He didn't reach for them, but his gaze lingered on the bag for a moment too long. "Police will want to see them," he said. "I'll show them when they get here," she answered. Another pause. Dawson walked to the radio on the wall and called dispatch, his voice steady and professional. He gave their location, explained there was a report of a body discovered off an old ridge trail, and requested assistance. The response crackled through the static officers would arrive within the hour. An hour felt like days. Dawson offered her water, which she accepted. She sipped slowly, her throat dry. He asked her questions, how long she'd been hiking, whether she had seen anyone else in the area, whether she had touched anything in the cabin. She answered carefully, watching him from the corner of her eye. His face remained calm, but she noticed that he kept glancing at the door, as if expecting someone besides the police. At last, a patrol SUV crunched across the gravel outside. Two officers stepped out, an older, with graying hair at his temples, and one younger, with a firm jaw and expressionless eyes. They introduced themselves as Officers Talbot and Green. Talbot listened to Dawson's briefing with a nod, then approached Rachel. "We understand you found a cabin with a deceased individual. We'll need you to describe the location." "I can take you there," she said. He shook his head. "Not necessary. You're exhausted, and conditions are changing. We'll send our own people." "But the area is hidden," she insisted. "I barely spotted the cabin. You won't find it without me." "We have coordinates based on your route," he replied. "We'll manage." Something in his voice suggested the decision wasn't up for debate. Green stepped closer. "We also heard you took some papers from the scene. Is that correct?" Rachel stiffened. "I didn't know it was a scene. And I didn't take much, just a few pages." "Could we see them?" he asked. His tone was neutral, but his eyes held an intensity that unsettled her. She reached for her pack, but stopped halfway, fingers curling tightly around the strap. Every instinct she had screamed at her to keep the pages hidden. "I'll give them to you when you come back from the cabin," she said quietly. Green's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Talbot cleared his throat. "All right. We'll head out now. Miss Morris, stay here until we return." She nodded, but did not relax until the officers exited and the SUV engine faded into the trees. Then silence pressed against the windows like a heavy fog. Dawson sat back down at his desk, but didn't open his logbook. He just watched her. After several minutes of unbearable quiet, he spoke softly. "Can I ask you something? Why did you go up there alone?" She ran a hand through her hair. "I needed something different, something quiet." "You found quiet," he murmured, almost too softly for her to hear. She flinched at the tone in his voice, something between pity and warning. Minutes passed, then an hour. Rain began tapping against the windows, a cold, narrow rain that swept across the mountains and blurred the tree line into a watercolor wash of gray and green. The officers didn't return. Dawson stepped outside to check the road, squinting into the downpour. When he returned, he looked unsettled. "They should have been back by now. Even if they didn't find anything, they would have radioed." Her pulse kicked into high gear. Maybe the signal dropped. "Maybe," he said, but the doubt was clear on his face. Another 30 minutes passed, then another. At last, the radio crackled. Dawson lunged toward it, pressing the call button. "Talbot? Green? Is that you?" Static. Then a voice, faint and distorted. "Station. This is Ridge Team. Nothing found. No cabin." Rachel rose to her feet, dread running cold through her veins. "What do you mean, no cabin?" The radio crackled harder, then fell silent completely. Dawson tried again. Nothing. "No cabin," Rachel whispered. "That's impossible." Dawson paced. "Miss Morris, you need to understand. Storms can erase trails. Structures can collapse." "That cabin wasn't collapsed," she said sharply. "It was intact. Fully intact." He didn't argue, but he didn't look convinced either. The rain intensified, rattling the roof. Then something hit the window, a soft tap, then another. Dawson approached cautiously and peered outside. Rachel joined him, dread coiling in her gut. Under the trees, barely visible through the slanting rain, stood the man in the gray coat. He didn't move, didn't signal, just watched. Rachel's breath hitched. Dawson swore under his breath and reached for the radio again. "Station requesting backup. Possible unknown individual outside. Respond." Only static answered him. The man stepped back, melting into the forest without a sound. Dawson locked the door and drew the curtains. "Miss Morris, I need you to tell me exactly what happened when you saw him." She recounted every detail, the breathing outside her tent, the symbol carved into the tree, the map he returned, the way he appeared and disappeared with impossible quiet. Dawson listened intently, but every new detail seemed to erode the calm professionalism in his expression. "You said the pages you took mentioned people who watch?" he asked finally. She nodded. "I need to see them," he said. Her heartbeat thudded painfully. She didn't want to hand them over, but she didn't know who else to trust. Still, something felt wrong. The pages felt like the only thing connecting her to the truth, and she wasn't sure Dawson or the officers were interested in truth. Instead of answering, she reached into her pack and pulled out only one page. The first. The one titled, Chapter 7, On the Ones Who Watch. Dawson took it carefully, reading the lines with growing unease. When he finished, he set the page down. This isn't something a hiker should have," he said quietly. "That's not my fault," she snapped. "I didn't choose to find any of this." "I know." He looked genuinely sympathetic. "But whoever wrote this didn't intend it for the public." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the station with ghostly white. Thunder rumbled a moment later, deep enough to shake the window glass. The radio suddenly came alive with urgent static. Dawson grabbed it. "This is Station 14. We need confirmation on the ridge search." A burst of static, then a faint voice. "Station. No evidence. No body. No cabin. Are you sure initial report was accurate?" Dawson stared at the radio, then glanced at Rachel. "We're sure," he said, voice low. But she wasn't sure of anything anymore. The storm passed eventually, drifting across the mountains like a dark curtain drawn away from a stage. The sky beyond remained dim and colorless, offering no comfort. Dawson insisted they wait for backup to arrive before making any decisions, but Rachel could feel something tightening around her, like a net. The officer's failure to find the cabin haunted her. The man in the gray coat haunted her. And now the station itself felt wrong, isolated, watched, unsafe. Hours later, long after sundown, a knock sounded at the door. Dawson froze. Another knock, harder this time. "Who is it?" he called. No answer. Rachel clenched her fists. Then a calm, steady voice spoke from the other side of the door. "Let me in," the voice said. "I have something for her." Her blood turned to ice. She recognized the voice. It was him, the man in the gray coat. Dawson moved toward the door, but Rachel grabbed his arm. "Don't open it." But it didn't matter. A folded envelope slid under the door, skimming across the floor until it stopped at her feet. Dawson lifted it cautiously. It was addressed to her. Inside was a USB flash drive. A short note was tucked in behind it. "This is all he wanted left behind," it read. "Do not fear what you do not yet understand." Her hands shook as she held the drive light, cold, ordinary in appearance, yet impossibly charged with meaning. "What is it?" Dawson asked. "I think," she whispered. "I think it's from Kelvin." Those words changed everything. And in that moment, standing in a ranger station swallowed by shadows and silence, she realized the truth. She had not stumbled into a mystery. She had trespassed into someone else's ending. And whoever had written that ending was not finished with her yet. The flash drive felt too small to contain anything significant, yet too heavy to be meaningless. As Rachel held it in her hand, its cold plastic edges pressing into her palm, she felt as though some invisible thread stretched from the cabin on the cliff straight to this moment, drawing her deeper into something she neither chose nor fully understood. Dawson watched her with wide, uncertain eyes, clearly torn between duty and a growing fear he didn't want to name. "We shouldn't open it here," he said at last, his voice cracking slightly despite his attempt to hold it steady. "If this is evidence, or something dangerous." But Rachel wasn't listening. The flash drive felt like a key not just to the mystery she had stumbled into, but to Kelvin himself, to the truth buried under years of speculation and silence. Whatever was on it, she knew it was meant for her. The man in the gray coat had said so, and for reasons she couldn't explain, she believed him. Dawson hesitated when she moved toward the small desk, where an old computer sat humming quietly. "Miss Morris, please, "We should wait. Backup will be here any minute." She didn't respond. Her hands trembled as she inserted the drive. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the screen flickered, and a single file appeared. A video. No title, no timestamp, just a blank icon waiting to be opened. She clicked it. The screen dissolved into an image so grainy she thought at first it was corrupted. Then the shapes sharpened into the interior of a cabin, Kelvin's cabin. The same desk, the same typewriter, the same clay stove. For a moment the room was empty, lit by the faint orange glow of embers. Then he stepped into frame. Andrew Kelvin. Not the lifeless figure slumped in the chair she had found, but alive, frail, exhausted, older than any photo the world had ever seen, but breathing, moving, existing. He sat down slowly, wincing as though his very bones ached. His hand settled on the desk, fingers brushing the cover of a notebook. He took a long, shaky breath before lifting his gaze to the camera. "If you're watching this," he began, "then I failed to finish what I started." His voice was weaker than she expected, softer. Yet there was clarity there, a deliberate effort to speak despite whatever pain, fear, or resignation lived beneath his words. "I asked him to record this," Kelvin continued, in case time ran out. He looked away briefly, eyes drifting toward something off camera. Not fearfully, more like someone glancing at a companion waiting patiently in the corner. When his eyes returned to the lens, there was a sad steadiness in them. "I chose to disappear. I want that understood. I chose silence over applause, anonymity over worship, fame." He paused, searching for breath. Fame became an echo of my own thoughts. It devoured what was left of me. I couldn't write without seeing my own reflection staring back, judging every word. So I left. I walked away. Rachel's chest tightened. There was something haunting in his honesty, something fragile and real. "But I didn't leave alone," Kelvin continued. "I was helped, guided, protected." His lip quivered faintly. "There are people who understand what it means to vanish without dying. People who help others slip through the cracks when the world becomes too loud to bear. I trusted them. I still do." He smiled faintly, a sad, tired smile that looked like it had taken all his remaining strength. "I wanted to finish one last story, a story about disappearance, about watchers, about the quiet spaces between fame and oblivion. But my hands, my mind, they betray me now." His voice faltered, his shoulders slumped. "He offered to help," Kelvin whispered, "to finish it for me if I could not, to mimic my hand so the story wouldn't die unfinished. I agreed." He swallowed hard. "But I fear what that means now." The room around him suddenly darkened as the fire dipped. Shadows crept along the walls. Kelvin leaned forward, his eyes suddenly intense. "If you found this cabin," he said, "you must be careful. Curiosity opens doors the world meant to keep shut." His breathing quickened. "The Watchers are not enemies, but they are guardians of things that cannot be easily explained, and they do not welcome interference." He paused, the air thick with unspoken warning. "If the story reached you, finish it. Tell it. Not mine. Yours. Tell the truth of what you saw, not what I wrote." He lifted a trembling hand. "And if you meet him, the man who helped me disappear, do not fear him. He has kept my silence safe all these years." His gaze drifted downward. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, softly, "Let me rest in peace." The screen went black. Rachel stared at the blank monitor, her mind numb, her breath shallow. Kelvin wasn't speaking to the world. He had spoken to her, not because she was special, but because she had become the witness he hadn't planned for, a stranger who had opened a door too soon. Dawson ran a hand through his hair, pacing restlessly. That can't be real. It can't be. But the fear in his voice betrayed him. It is, Rachel whispered. What are we supposed to do with this? He demanded, but she could hear the desperation beneath his frustration. Where are the officers? Why hasn't backup arrived? Why? A knock cut him off. Soft. Measured. Familiar. Dawson grabbed the nearest drawer, fumbling for whatever weapon might be hidden inside, but Rachel knew it wouldn't make a difference. She stepped toward the door as though drawn by some invisible force. "Miss Morris," Dawson hissed. "Step back." But she didn't. She opened the door. The man in the gray coat stood on the porch, rain dripping from his hood. His expression was neither threatening nor warm. It was simply steady, as though he had been waiting for this moment since she first set foot on the ridge. "You saw it," he said. Not a question, a statement. "Yes," she answered. He nodded. "Then you understand." "I understand that he didn't die alone," she said, her voice trembling. "And I understand that someone finished his work for him." She stepped slightly closer. "Was it you?" "Some stories shouldn't be left unfinished," he said quietly. Dawson raised a trembling arm, trying to hold him at bay, but the man didn't bother looking in his direction. His eyes stayed on Rachel. "The officers you think are coming won't be here," he said. "They were never meant to find anything." "What does that mean?" Dawson snapped. The man finally glanced at him. His gaze wasn't hostile, just deeply, unbearably tired. "Sometimes the world is safer when a story remains inside the mountains." Rachel felt a shiver run through her. But Kelvin wanted his truth told. He wanted peace, the man corrected, and he wanted silence. You can honor both without feeding the machine that destroyed him. He paused. "Write your story, Miss Morris." "Not his. Yours." "How do I know it's safe to tell mine?" she whispered. "Because it already is," he replied. "You survived. That alone means you were allowed to leave." He stepped back into the rain. "But understand this. Finish your story, and then walk away. Don't go looking for more. Don't return to the ridge." She swallowed hard. "Will I ever know everything?" "No," he said simply. "And that is your protection." He turned, coat billowing faintly with the wind, and began walking toward the tree line. Within moments, the rain and shadows blurred him into the forest until he disappeared completely. Dawson stood frozen, face pale. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. Rachel didn't answer. She closed the door gently, then sank into a chair, her body trembling not from fear, but from the overwhelming weight of understanding. Kelvin's words echoed in her mind. "Finish your story. Tell the truth of what you saw." But not his truth. Hers. As the storm faded, replaced by a still, heavy quiet, she knew what she had to do. Not hide. Not run. Not expose some conspiracy she herself didn't fully grasp. She had to write. In the days that followed, life crept back around her like air returning to lungs long starved of oxygen. The news did not mention a discovered cabin or the body of Andrew Kelvin. No search parties formed. No statements were made. It was as though her encounter with the greatest literary disappearance of modern history had dissolved the moment she stepped off the ridge. But something had changed. Her dreams were no longer filled with empty offices and quiet resentments. Instead, she dreamed of cliffs and cabins and firelight. Of a man who had written himself out of the world. Of another who walked through forests like a shadow with purpose. And she dreamed of her own voice, stronger now, no longer trembling under the weight of silence. She began writing. At first it came slowly, her hands uncertain. But as days passed, the words poured out with the force of a dam breaking. She wrote about the trail, the cabin, the impossible light in the window, the symbol on the tree, the breathing outside her tent, the man who returned her map. The ranger station swallowed by strange quiet. She wrote not to expose, but to understand. One morning, after hours of writing, she stepped outside to collect the mail. The air was cool, the sky bright. Birds stirred in the branches. Her street felt ordinary, safe. In the mailbox lay a single envelope, no return address. Her breath caught. Hands trembling slightly, she opened it. Inside was a small slip of paper, a single sentence, written in a hand she knew too well. "Thank you for giving me back my voice." Her knees nearly buckled. She held the note against her chest as a wave of emotion washed over her. Grief for the writer she found too late. Gratitude for the stranger who protected his memory. Fear of the world she had glimpsed and could never unsee. And something else, too. Peace. She walked back inside, sat at her desk, and placed the note beside her manuscript. Then she kept writing. Not about the Watchers, not about the man in the gray coat, not about the secrets that lived in the mountains. She wrote about the moment her own silence ended. And with every word, she felt herself return fully, firmly, finally to the world. If you want more stories like this, hit subscribe. Watch the next videos on the channel. There's more you should see. And share this video with someone who needs to hear it.